So, with that in mind, I don't want her upset, and she could do damage to me when I give my talk the next time. I have placed on your table at least one of the brochures. For those of you who have not seen this, I would be very happy. I've got more of them here, and I'd love to give you copies of that. So don't leave if you've not seen a copy that will tell you the names of all the talks that are being given here at Newman. First off, so that you know, this is a second half to a series that we started last year. We started talking about Monsignor McNeill, and so far we've presented his early years. We've talked about him in relation to being the superintendent of schools and actually the starting of Sacred Heart Junior College and his work with that up to 1945. We also, though, have talked, I can't remember the next one. My mind just went just like that. Anyway, I just know that what we're concentrating on this year is primarily after kind of the middle of the 40s, and we're concentrating on that till the end of his life. The very last talk will be a summation, and Joyce and I will attempt to do that together, of the key things that we want to take away from all of this. I'm very happy that Father Dwight Burkett has joined us today. You might put your hand up, or for those who don't know you, he will be giving that third talk in March. We're really looking forward to it also. So with no further ado, I turn this over to Joyce Solitrop, who's the real historian here.
When Charlotte and I started talking about this talk, we didn't know what to call it. We decided on Monsignor McNeill's Catholic Publications. And basically it is about Monsignor McNeill as a writer, but also his involvement in Catholic publishing. I would think that I should call it Bits and Pieces because I've had a hard time getting any cohesion. And if confusion leads to clarity, let's hope that it's clear by the time I go through this for you all, but it might be the other way around. I vastly underestimated the amount of material that I needed to go through. In fact, I went through some this morning right before this, and I overestimated my ability to deal with that material. So, does that sound familiar? I think some politician said that just this past week. Okay, if you have not been here, or if you have, I'd like to recall a little bit about Monsignor McNeill, that he was at St. Benedict's at Atchison for his senior year and his minor seminary years from 1918 to 1920. I think that he probably wrote for the student newspaper, but I have no evidence to back that up. The summer of 1924, and so from 21 to 27, he was a student at St. Meinrad Seminary. The summer of 1924, as part of a mission unit, he and other students at the seminary put together an illustrated lecture on the colored missions, and he went to the East Coast to present this. He used a stereopticon, went 13 places, and I'm mentioning this because one of the things I'm going to do is show the connections that he made. He stopped in Chicago, Kentucky, New York City, Pennsylvania, Indiana at Notre Dame, Washington, D.C. at Catholic U, and particularly for the summer session of the Sisters College there. He made contacts in his own words when he wrote an autobiography in 1928. He made contacts with Catholic institutions and Catholic leaders, and that's one thing that I'm going to hopefully illustrate. I will use some specific names because these names recur over and over and over again in his work. Some of them you have already heard. Summer school at Notre Dame, 1925, 26, and 27. And then he spent the term of 1927-28 at Catholic U. I'm not sure when he was appointed superintendent of school, whether it was at the beginning, the end of 27, or the beginning of 28, but it figures into this. I think that we need to consider his education, and I say it's both Catholic and classical. He studied languages, Latin and Greek, at St. Benedict's, and he, of course, would have read the classics. You have to consider his profession, priest, and, of course, as an educator, his personality and his energy. Consider also that his life intersects with the Catholic intellectual revival from, I'll say, from 1920s on. And that included the liturgical movement that I will mention. We talked about Catholic Action. We talked about the National Catholic Welfare Conference. It also included the Catholic Worker Movement, the Catholic Press Movement, and the CCD movement. It also included, and this figures heavily, the professionalization of education, not only Catholic, but of course public education. This, of course, was a fertile field for Monsignor McNeill and his, quote, quick flow of words and ideas. And that was mentioned that a fellow seminarian wrote that about him. In the talk, I hope to do this. I'll mention information from earlier talks, show connections, talk about the development of the Catholic publishing field, the changes in religious education, both in content and methods, the network of people that Monsignor McNeill ran with, no, that's not right, but was involved with. And he was one of maybe 7 people that were always identified as educational leaders in the Catholic education. I'll talk about the range and importance of his work, and this is where it gets a little confusing, the revision of manuals. And that would be the manual for religious vacation schools, manual for CCD, and the manual for elementary school children who went to public schools. So if you just put manuals in your mind, I think that'll get it. I also, maybe will touch on or make comments or ask you to think about how the church worked then and how maybe it is beginning to change at the end of this. I divided into time periods, and then that didn't work, so I divided it then into divisions of labor. His early writing is from 1927 on. That's his earliest piece of published writing. He had written a letter to Reverend William J. Kirby, who was editor of the Ecclesiastical Review, published at Catholic University, a monthly magazine for priests. And he wanted to submit an article, and he did submit that article in September of 1927. Kirby wrote back that it was an admirable article, but he needed to ease the personal praise of Mrs. Ward, who lives here at Catholic University. It's not Maisie Ward of Sheed and Ward Publishing, it is Justine Ward. And she was a leader in the liturgical movement of restoring Gregorian chant, and she became actively involved on many different levels. There is a Ward method of teaching Gregorian chant for elementary school teachers, and she put that together with the methods from Catholic University professor Reverend Thomas E. Shields, and that's sometimes known as the Shields method. She taught at the Sisters College at Catholic U. She founded or helped found the Pius X Institute of Liturgical Music in 1918, came back to Catholic University and taught at the School of Liturgical Music. I mention that only to give you context because it's evident that McNeill knew her, and one of her students at Catholic U was Angela Clendenin. And if you were here earlier, you know this was a laywoman here in Wichita who was involved in many different things. She attended summer school there in 1927. The article was called Sacred Music, Its Restoration, and it was 13 pages long. And basically, most of the article is the history of the Gregorian chant. And one of his sources that he used was a professor at Benedict's. He, of course, gives his view, and then he gives a reading list. His view was that reform was needed because the spirit of the concert hall had entered the church. The choir appeared on a public stage. There were theatrical stars, and the the purpose was to entertain the audience. Now, this is in 1927, 1928. And the gist of his article was to restore the genuine text of the Gregorian chant, and that's certainly what the liturgical movement was about, and also the work of Mrs. Ward, or Miss Ward. And this is the article where at the end, Kirby asks or writes to him, question mark, how can you do the work so well and not be a Benedictine? And I guess I should ask, with Catholic education, he also had a Benedictine education. He will write 3 or more articles for the Ecclesiastical Review during this period of time. Another one is Catholic Rural Action, and there was one talk on the Catholic Rural Life movement. The 6th annual meeting was held of the Catholic Rural Life, was held at St. Benedict's in September of 1928. He attended, and he had queried Kirby at the Ecclesiastical Review to say, I'd like to write the proceedings of that, to write a review of it. He published Catholic Rural Action in the Clergy, and it's 10 pages long. And he basically gives the program and what each person said about Catholic rural life. I'm not going to belabor this, but I want to mention some names that reappear again and again in his life. Dr. Wolf spoke about rural education. He was from Iowa, and he talked about a curriculum for rural students. And then that point of view was discussed by Monsignor McNeill, and a pastor by the name of Father Schlitz from Iowa also responded. And this was a statement of summary. In the high school, and now they're talking about rural students who would have gone to public high schools mainly. Children lose all love of country, develop habits of laziness, and come out of school with sophisticated minds, self-indulgent wills, and with no special preparation for any kind of life. Some of this sounds so familiar to what comes out of my mouth sometimes. The religious vacation school was talked about by Margaret Lynch, and she was the executive secretary of the National Conference for Catholic Welfare. The rural problem in Mexico, Father Edwin O'Hara, and that's a name that appears again and again, talked about. He had visited Mexico, and it was the issue of land reform, the issue of poverty, and insufficient food. A Bishop Knoll talked about bigotry in rural areas. K-State experts came to talk about farm home and farm business, and the closing was by the Jesuit John Lafarge, and his name appears quite often. The second division that I have is writing about Catholic education. Remember, he was appointed superintendent in 1928, right when he was getting his master's degree from Catholic U. During that time and into the 30s, he was a member of the National Catholic Educational Association and the head of the executive committee for parish school department. He also was the head of the superintendent's meeting, and this involved, of course, the planning, but also in the conferences giving presentations. I'll just read you some of the articles that he wrote and some of the titles, and this is probably from, maybe 1928 through 34. Rural courses of study, education, and rural action. And remember, at this time, part of this time, he is running the Sisters College here in Wichita. He is the superintendent of school, and then, of course, Sacred Heart opens. The diocesan superintendent and religious instruction of public school pupils, the need of religious education of Catholics in public high schools, and that one was a little different because it was published in a diocesan paper. And he also published in the Register here in Wichita some of his work. This one was published in California, and I thought, well, I didn't think it was odd, but I thought how interesting that that it was published in California. I couldn't really figure out how it got there. But then I did some research right before this, and I'll give you the answer later. What shall we do for our boys and girls in public high schools? During this time, he is also the author and editor of the Manual of Religious Vacation Schools. He was asked to do that by Edwin O'Hara, and this movement had started in the diocese in 1929, and by 1936 there were 77 religious vacation schools, covered from primary through high school. In 1965, a person who is writing his doctoral thesis in California writes McNeill and says, "What do you know about the Manual of Religious Vacation Schools? What do you know about the putting together of that manual?" And of course, Monsignor McNeill was a wonderful writer, and he was, I think, a historian, and so he wrote his memories, and there were specific questions that were asked. And he said he was asked by O'Hara, and then he gives the names of the people that were involved with him and gives a history of the writing of this. And this is important because then it's going to be revised again and again. Let's see. From 1930 to 1960, then there will be several revisions of that manual. And in 1931, which is the original manual, the one that McNeill wrote most of, and a priest by the name of Callahan checked. The Maisie Ward, who was married to Frank Sheed, and they lived in England and ran a publishing house there, somehow found out about it, probably with correspondence with Monsignor McNeill, I think. And she wanted a copy of that report because she wanted to try something in England in their village where they had a home. So he sent her a report, and she replied saying that she was going to try it in England. And to me, that establishes, of course, that he knew her and knew her well enough that they corresponded. Sheed and Ward, of course, was the first Catholic publishing house, and Frank Sheed came to the United States in 1929 and 1931 to give a lecture tour. And on one of those, he came to Wichita, and McNeill was the one who made all the reservations and the schedule for that trip. They moved as a couple to New York in 1933, and then they become part of the publishing world in the United States. What happened in those early years, and what I've accounted, is that he established writing as an important part of his life and a process that really brought success to him. And this is my definition of him as a writer. He had a very thoughtful approach, and in his letters he will think out what he wants to say, whether he's writing to a publisher, a friend, a fellow priest, etc. Had a very clear writing style. It was very logical, and usually he outlined, and then he would query a publisher or whoever was dealing with this, or send a letter. He also, of course, had broad knowledge. He writes what he knows, and if he doesn't know it, he will say, I'm not going to write about that. I will find someone capable of writing about that. And he edits word by word and goes through several drafts of whatever he's writing. He's also very assertive in his writing. He's always thinking what he can write, what form, what needs to be said, and what is needed by primarily education, what the children need to know and what is the best way to teach them. He asks for help. He might send a letter and say, I'm having trouble phrasing this. Is this the correct phrase? And sometimes it's a word, a or the. Should he use that? He uses the sources he knows, and he is, without doubt, the most prolific and rapid writer at that time, I think, here. He didn't churn out, he wrote, produced many pieces of writing, plus doing all these other things. So then that establishes that he's going to be very active in Catholic publishing. And with my limited knowledge of Catholic publishing, I'm just going to give you a very brief timeline. In the 20s, it was very active and it was growing. There were publishing houses that were being formed, and you'll hear about 2 of them. And then the 1930s came, and they began to write of the Depression, the price of paper skyrocketing, the increase in second-class postage, and the drop in circulation. And I know, because I've done some research with the register here in the diocese, that the newspapers were hit the same way. And you will hear about that as we move as I talk about the Young Catholic Messenger. In the 1940s, then, things improved financially, but then there was another problem. Many of the endeavors did not make money, and it was a lot of what they were writing was losing in popularity. People didn't want it. They wanted a different style of writing and maybe different content. And under this, we'll tuck the Baltimore Catechism, because one of the publishing houses that I'm going to talk about is the one who published the Baltimore Catechism here in the United States, and the revisions, the revisions over a number of years. And it is during the 40s that those revisions become what I'll call interesting, I guess. And the revisions will deal with, should there be supplementary material or not to the Baltimore Catechism? We need to have readability, so should we change the vocabulary we're using? Should there be annotations? With the Young Catholic Messenger, we need a different kind of artwork. We need different kinds, subjects and articles, and different topics. And should the parents have a role? Should the Baltimore Catechism or those messenger magazines be addressed to parents so that parents can help their students study? And should the material be lighter in tone? So that in itself could be a whole speech, I think. Two examples of publishing houses. One is Sadlier, and I think it came out of New York, I'm not sure on that. But Monsignor McNeill had a relationship from 1927 into the 60s with that publishing house. There are some gaps in the correspondence, but I'm assuming that because it's picked up in the 60s that he kept in contact with them. At one point, they were asked to publish the manual for vacation school, the revision of it. It seemed to go nowhere. As far as I know, it didn't go anywhere. But he wrote to a fellow person in the publishing area that it was encouraging to know that the Episcopal Committee is making some move toward producing a satisfactory catechetical text. He also mentions that Sadler published the Furlong History Series, and that St. Patrick's Experimental School here in Wichita adopted it from the 4th to the 8th grade. I'm not familiar with why St. Patrick's was called an experimental school, and so someone might be able to, and this was in 1931, so someone might be able to enlighten me on that. The other one is the Flom Publishing Company, and this is the one he also had a relationship from the late 30s into the 60s, and it was located in Dayton, Ohio. His correspondence is with the father, and then the son, and then various representatives. And it is very interesting correspondence and much correspondence. He did seem to have a personal relationship with the Flom family. He would know when they're going on vacation, they would stop through Wichita, various members of the family, and visit him. And they've also published the manuals that he was dealing with, and they published the Messenger series. I think most people remember or know the Young Catholic Messenger, which was published from 1885 up to 1970. There was also a Junior Catholic. I thought that was a cat. There was also the Junior.
Attracted to your talks.
No, my cat got my purse. Also, the Junior Catholic Messenger, Our Little Messenger, and Treasure Chest. It was just a collection of magazines that Flom published, and McNeill was the writing staff editor. He is the one for the Young Catholic Messenger who gathered the writers and gave them the articles that they needed to write, and then they would consult him about editing, etc. And this is probably from, I will say, the 1940s to the 60s. Now remember, of course, what he's doing all this time. He would find the articles, or the writers, they would write the articles. They got 75% of the payment, and he got 25% of the payment. There was a series that they would do on different things like the gospel, the life of Christ, etc. And one concern, and then a lot of correspondence deals with this, he wanted to find quality catechetical authors, people who knew catechetics. And he would simply ask them, what is your experience, what have you published? And then they would tell him, and then he would say, good, you can write, etc. There is a thick, thick file from a priest, and his last name, I believe, is pronounced Castelot, and he is an expert of catechetics, and they are the ones who go back and forth when the article is written. Should I have a thee? Should I have an a? Should this word go before this word? So it was very careful editing, and this was all done, of course, not by phone, but by letters. And they commented both on content, but also, of course, on writing. Now, this is where it gets a little murky or even murkier. So I'm going to switch now into some other manual revisions. 1937 to 1944, Bishop Winkleman, Edwin O'Hara were on the executive committee for the Manual for Religion Teachers of Public Education Elementary School Students. McNeill was the general chairman of the manual, and he worked quite closely with them. The revision of, let's see, how am I going? There was a revision proposed in 1941. I think it actually came out in 1945. And then there was one proposed in 47, and I'm not sure when it came out. I think it did, but I didn't have time really to study all of this. It comes out of, or it has to work with, the National Center of CCD, which was formed in 1934 because every parish had a CCD by 1933. It was also located in Dayton, Ohio, where Flom Publishing was. In the 1940s, there were two concerns about this manual and other manuals. Should the manual be graded, divided into segments for different levels, or for every grade, and should there be supplementary material? And if there is going to be supplementary material, who is going to do that, and how will it merge with whatever is in the manual? Same thing with the Baltimore Catechism. As the revision of the manuals are going on, and McNeill is highly involved in those, then there is a revision of the Baltimore Catechism suggested in 1935. And the suggestion was that they needed to have a workbook with it, enrichment material, and this was based on a survey taken by Edwin O'Hara. He had someone send out, I believe, 1,000 to 1,000 people a survey about religious education. At that time, McNeill, I don't know what his position was other than being the chair of that committee, but he asked a Father Ostdike, who had just become the superintendent of the Omaha Diocese, to help. And that priest said he was old-fashioned and like the Baltimore Catechism, and he didn't think health and recreation should be part of it. So what is happening is, and this is coming from the CCD, the National Center, and from parishes and pastors and superintendents, is that they want to introduce some current, what they viewed as problems in the society and for the children into some of the manuals or the Baltimore Catechism. McNeill answered to him that Ostdike was just old-fashioned enough to be sensible. I don't know what became of Ostdike. I don't know if he worked or not, but he is a name that appears. Okay, so that's about in 1941, and I should mention, I love to pull out quotes when this Father Ostdike wrote McNeill and wanted some help because he had just become the diocese superintendent. He said at the end, he said something to the effect, God pity me, my job, because he didn't know anything about being a superintendent. And McNeill, there are letters back and forth where he is sending him things and helping him along. Okay, so the National Center then that was formed is part of this revision. And then there is an Episcopal committee coming out of the American bishops. And so the suggested revision is 1945. There's a complicating factor. They asked Flom Publishing to publish it. By this time, Monsignor McNeill's brother, Charles McNeill, who is younger, is working for Flom as a representative. And then Monsignor writes for, or is the editor of the Young Catholic Messenger. Flom publishes all the Catholic Messenger, all of that group. And then there's this complication of, should there be supplements? Should we have better artwork, different artwork? All of this is going on. And the fear was that with these revisions, the Catholic Young Messenger would either be ignored or slighted, not required, not talked about, and that the supplements, if they had supplements, would come from somewhere else other than the Young Catholic Messenger, which was one of the plans. So I said it's going to get murkier, so I have divided this almost like a war, but it wasn't. There are different players. Okay, so we have Monsignor McNeill and the executive committee. We have Flom Publishing, and then we have, and this is how they identified the Peoria Aledo crowd, and it was a Reverend Shields, not the one from Catholic University, and the Franciscan sisters who in the 1930s created and distributed materials for public school children who were Catholic. And Flom published those materials. They had the beginning of graded. They had primary and lower intermediate. Not grade by grade, but section by section. And they did not require the Young Messenger. And then enters Sister Rosalia, who was appointed chairman of the CCD manual by the Center for the CCD. She had like a 20-year relationship with that. She is a member of the Mission Helpers of the Sacred Heart in Maryland. She and 4 other sisters were appointed, and all of the sisters were said to be highly trained and widely experienced catechists. They excel in religious education for public school children. They had written materials that had been distributed and was used in 44 states. So you have the Peoria Aledo crowd, Sister Rosalia, and Sister Rosalia seems to cause Charles McNeill a great deal of grief because he is a representative and he travels around and he's trying to get the revision going. And according to him, and there's, I don't know how many letters from him to Leon McNeill. Doing most of the planning, Sister Rosalia is. Miss Marks, and Miss Marks is another one from the National Center, have completely turned over the manuals project to Sister Rosalia's committee, and now this is Charles talking, and that means to Sister Rosalia herself. She thought, according to him, that she did not have to consult the people out in the parishes and the diocese, that they could rewrite that manual, and that it was simply not necessary. She thought that her committee had perfect freedom to consult only the National Center for the CCD. And she had put together, or they had put together materials, and it was called The Adaptive Way. Now, I, of course, am really swimming here, but there are many different ways of teaching religion to students who go to public schools. And it was considered a radical departure from the previous, because it was grade by grade. There would be material from first grade through the 8th grade. There was no need for lesson plans, according to Sister Rosalia and that committee, and no need for worksheets. And that, of course, would sort of X out the messenger. The underlying philosophy was to adapt methods of teaching to the nature and needs of the child. No memorization, and then you get hooked, of course, into the Baltimore Catechism problem. Okay, then Monsignor sends a letter to Flom, and he discusses the developments in the CCD field in a frank and extensive way. Unfortunately, I have not found that letter. It's referred to by his brother Charles. So we may have the letter, we may not, I don't know. It would be interesting because later you'll hear about a 4-page letter that he sent to Flom Publishing. Charles then, to Monsignor, writes about his irritation with the National Center. He said, I, Charles, need to, quote, cultivate your ability to take things and also to view all things in the light of complete charity. So this revision, which started in 1941, going on in 1945, 46, 47, more research simply is needed. And then you need to have, the manuals, and you need to compare the revision. So it's a lifetime work. I'm not going to do it. All right. Fast forward 20 years. Now Monsignor McNeill is writing James Flom, the son of George. He sent him a 4-page letter in 1962 about his concerns and the considerations for another revision. He said he had been asked by Miss Marks to write a textbook, but he doesn't designate specifically what kind of a textbook, and he wants to avoid the Baltimore Catechism and Catechism. So he wants to write it, I take it, on his own. He has read some recent works, and then he said some of us have entered into the extra study of catechetics. Quite a discussion at this time and considerable disagreement, and this is in 1962. 1963, Flom is asked to publish the revision, and these are, now it's at the murkiest point. There is controversy about the Baltimore Catechism and religion textbooks. Flom did not want to be caught in the middle because they published them and they didn't want to take a stand on the revision at all. And the Messenger series, which Flom also published, was tied to the CCD movement and also the revised Baltimore Catechism. Okay, so are you with me? Okay, so in his letter, he reviews, I said he's a historian, he reviews the history of the revisions, or some of them, and he talks about one of the early, the 41 revision, I'll say, and he said that the National Center was committed to the Baltimore Catechism. They would not budge on that. There was no possibility of a new catechism, so a Miss Homans was asked to write a revision, and according to him, she sent the revision to Wichita, and it was a strike, and the Sadler Publishing thought it was a hit, but it didn't go anywhere, and he said it should have gone ahead. So that, I don't know what happened to that revision, but it didn't make it through, didn't make the cut. The second part of this is that the Messenger was, of course, in favor of the revision of supplements, new images, different levels, parents, and it was his opinion that the National Center would go along with the Messenger if the Messenger would go along with the Baltimore Catechism. And then he said that there are many good ideas coming from it. I'm not sure that I'm pronouncing this. The Kergmatic movement. Anyone know? It's a return to the Bible, Christ-centered history of salvation focus. And he had read Father Johann Hoffinger. Now, this would be interesting person, who helped lay the foundation for Vatican II. He was called the Catechetical Sputnik because he circled the globe 16 times between 1953 and 1970 talking about the catechetical movement. And he wrote a book called The Art of Teaching Doctrine. McNeill had also read of Father Leo J. Treese, The Faith Explained, which was adult catechism, and Father Francis J. Connell, the text of the 1941 revision that had not been printed yet. His final thoughts was that the Plum Publishing should not get in the controversy, that he would cooperate with the National Center and the Mission Helpers, Sister Rosalia's work, because she had been to Wichita and she and her sisters, her fellow sisters, had written a study guide for the young Catholic messengers. See how it gets all before them. So this could be the conclusion, but not really, because much more research needs to be done. The last area, how am I doing on time?
Oh, I've got 15 till.
Okay. The last area I selected is Catholic publishing here in Wichita. And the Catholic Action Bookshop was from like 1929 into the 60s. And it was a project of Monsignor McNeill, but also the Catholic Women Council, or the Catholic Council of Women in the Diocese. Angela Clendenin at one time was the manager. There was a Madeline Aaron. The women that appeared in many different activities, including the activities at Sacred Heart, were involved in the Catholic Bookshop. They published discussion club textbooks in the 30s. In the 30s, there were 114 book discussion groups for women in the diocese. And the Catholic Bookshop published those books. A total of 15. Monsignor McNeill wrote some. Angela Clendenin wrote. Madeline Aaron wrote. Sometimes they co-authored. Charles McNeill wrote. So it was a small publishing business. The first book that Monsignor McNeill wrote for that was in 1935, and his last one was in 1947. And sometimes, as I said, he was the author, he was the co-author. Sometimes he would write the foreword, sometimes he would have discussion questions, and all the time he found the people to write those. He was literally head of that publishing at the bookshop, and he was full of ideas. The manuals, articles, pamphlets, magazines, study booklets, etc. And I'm going to talk only about one endeavor because I just discovered it just like 2 days ago, and to me it's fascinating. It's only the beginning though. In the 60s, they revived the series of discussion books for discussion groups, but the discussion groups now were men and women, not women. And it was called the New Horizons series. And it was similar to the operation in the 1930s. One of the series of books that I'm assuming he decided to publish was a series on the ecumenical councils. And then there is a complication. The complication is that by this time Charles McNeill has left Flom, and he had gone into a consulting firm that sort of kept the books for the Catholic Bookshop, a publishing consulting firm, but now he's over at Booklist, which is a service that he gave to bookstores and I don't know, evidently other officials. I don't know what exactly it was, but he was there. So he advised that they sell the Catholic Bookshop, and that means that they sell the new books, the backlist, and proposed books, not the physical bookshop. So they said, well, okay, we'll talk to Flom. Well, another complication is that publishing house was for sale. And then they were going to talk to a Father Berry at Ave Maria, and I'm not sure what that publication is. Okay, and then there's a further complication. in part of that New Horizons series in 1968, one of the books was a particular one by Father Bernard Herring, and this lasted April through September of 1968. The information comes from letters to and from Charles McNeill to Monsignor. Herring was asked to write and wrote a commentary on the pastoral constitution on the church in the modern world. And he served on the commission, so someone will know what that commission is, writing the pastoral constitution, I'm assuming, and he served as secretary. So he wrote a commentary. It was to be published by the Catholic Bookshop. And in there, he made comments on what he called birth regulation, we would call birth control, and responsible parenthood. Bishop Maloney refused to place the imprimatur on it, and then Humana Vitae was issued, and the Catholic Bookshop decided to look for another diocese to publish this commentary by Herring. Herring made some changes. He was willing to do that, and a Bishop Zelensky from Lansing, Michigan Diocese decided he would publish it. Then, according to the letters, that Bishop Maloney would not bow out, and that went against protocol. And I don't know if it was formal protocol or informal protocol. The book came out on September 26th, and there was a story in the NCR, and Bishop Maloney, no surprise, was displeased and had a long conversation with Monsignor McNeill. And Monsignor McNeill told his brother that he was not concerned about the outcome, and then that's the end of that correspondence. What happened to the book, I don't know if it was published or not. And I don't know the New Horizons series, where I don't have any. I had the earlier, but not this. Okay, McNeill at one time said to his brother, he said, "I will just walk out." Well, he didn't walk out. He did comment on the number of priests leaving the diocese. As far as I can tell, Ave Maria did buy the book list from the Catholic Bookshop. The Catholic Bookshop closed in 1969, and the Baltimore Catechism was revised, and there was a change in content and methods. So my conclusion, I don't want to call it my grand conclusion certainly, but that publishing had changed, and Flom was sold in 1970. Young Catholic Messenger ceased publication about that same time, and that many things had changed. Catholic education had changed. The church, if it hadn't changed, was changing, and I believe that Monsignor McNeill also changed. Now, I have missed a lot of things, and I'm sure that there are questions, comments, or conclusions other than I have drawn. So I'm going to end with this statement that I have made every time I've made a talk. A book needs to be written about Monsignor McNeill. He is more than anyone thinks or knows. So if you have questions or comments, please. Or are you in awe? This is most interesting. Yes?
You mentioned about St. Patrick's and that experimental. I'm on the Diocesan School Council, and we just recently were reviewing the biographies of several different religious women to see whose picture would go up. And there was one sister in there who was asked by Monsignor McNeill to introduce that curriculum, and that's all that said. But if you really want more about that, I think Bob Boberall would probably be able to give you more information.
Well, it's right at that time when, you know, people are wanting change, but no change is coming, and I just wondered. And it's the time when they're professionalizing education. So I would be interested. I'd never heard of it before. So, anyone else?
You talked about the say vocation, or was it
Vacation.
vacation, and that was for the public school kids, and it was during the summer, or what was?
It was for 6 weeks in the summer, and the ones who had gone to the public school during the school year would come and attend that. And they had extensive plans for it. So it was, I think what statistic, there were 77 of them in the diocese at one point. And the sisters would stay and teach in those schools.
So they would cover everything that the Catholic schools cover during the school year. And
I don't know if it was everything,
well,
but
as much as
they
could.
had a content outline.
And you talked about the church in the modern world. Was that an encyclical written?
The Constitution.
One of the constitutions, Vatican Council II.
Yeah, was it classified as an encyclical?
No, one of the documents.
One of the documents.
And that, was his name Harrison that we talked about? That
Herring.
H.A.
Is he from Belgium? He's European. Germany.
The book by Father Herring was published,
It was.
and it was available, but Bishop Maloney forbade him to sell them.
Oh.
And being the obedient man that he was, he did not sell them. So they were all kept in shelves out there in Aleppo, where he lived in the old convent building. And when Monsignor McNeill died, Father Bush was his executor. And he went to Bishop Maloney. He asked him what he was to do with all these books. And Bishop Maloney said, burn them. So Father Bush began the task of burning them and found it was impossible. So he found a farmer who buried them somewhere out there in western Sedgwick County. So any of you want a copy, you have to go out there and dig a hole somewhere in western Kansas.
So no copy, as far as you know, survived?
I didn't keep a copy.
Okay.
So was that before?
That was a very painful
Yes.
experience for him.
Yeah.
I can only imagine.
It was in 1968 when that happened. Within, just.
It was right at the same time, right after Humanae Vitae came out.
You're almost.
What was so objectionable?
Well, Father Herring was in favor of permitting birth control,
Uh-huh.
and he wrote it with a bias in that direction.
I see.
And Bishop Maloney was very orthodox. The Pope had spoken, so
Well, when they talked about the protocol, was that an informal or agreement among bishops that they shouldn't get involved in each other's?
I don't know about
Okay.
that.
What did Monsignor McNeil end up in good standing with Bishop Maloney or not?
Oh, oh yeah, he apologized. I remember that. He asked McNeil to apologize to the priests, and he did that quietly at a priest conference, and they were reconciled.
He apologized for...
I think McNeil also had some trouble with Bishop Carroll. He had some kind of breakdown. I don't know. That was before I was ordained, and Bishop Carroll kind of put him in charge of the hospital down in, that's where he was when I was ordained in '56. He was down in Fredonia. Then he was down at Villa Maria as the chaplain. And Bishop Byrne kind of resurrected him, and he became the ordinary in '63. And that's when he began these, some of you may remember that New Horizons program, which was a fundraising
Right.
thing that was a bit of a flop.
Yeah.
But the books sold great. The first one was on the liturgy, and it came out and it sold, I know he made a gift of $76,000,
Wow.
which was a lot of money, still a lot of money.
Yeah.
It was an awful lot of money in 1964 or 5. He made a lot of money on that book on the liturgy because it came out right as Vatican II approved of the document on the liturgy. And it was sold all over the country. It was maybe the only thing. It was written by Father Leonard, a Jesuit,
Okay.
I think. God bless him.
I want to make sure that I get with you because that's exactly what the next talk is about, the watershed years.
Okay, Noreen, in the letters between Charles and Monsignor McNeill, Monsignor McNeill said that Bishop Maloney was displeased, and he said the book was an embarrassment to the diocese, and that McNeill had set a bad example for younger priests.
But he continued on in the chancery office in the basement. He had this CCD correspondence well into the mid-70s, as I remember. So,
Okay.
you know, there wasn't a total breach.
Yeah, and then he eventually moved it out to CSJ. Was moved out there when they did some renovation of the chancel, and they needed more space in the basement. So it was moved out to the Sister St. Joseph.
And
And
he-
he continued working. He was a delightfully humble man. Just a great priest.
Yes,
Maybe
that's
the-
what I
Maybe
did.
the best second best after Father Burkett.
What I did not include is many of the quotes in many of the letters, and it is exactly what you said about him as a priest and as a person, but also his intelligence and his ability to work with people, and his brother said in complete charity, and that's sprinkled throughout. And also, he's always identified as an educational leader in national affairs. So,
He would write these books. No, he'd get other people to write the books, and then he would write the questions for discussion. And then there'd be another chapter, and he would write the questions. They were always good questions. He was a genius, but his biggest genius was using the genius of other people. He was always trying to enlist somebody. I mean, he tried to get me. I was trying to run the tribunal at the time. There were a lot of marriage cases coming in. He wanted me to correct papers for him. I had too many papers on my desk.
he did have a lot of connections, and I think he did work those connections. I mean, and those people that I mentioned, it is amazing. You need a flow chart because they were involved in everything, making important decisions. Yes.
Would you kind of speculate how he might operate in today's environment, given that?
This is only my speculation. I think at the end of his life, he was changing, and I don't even want to say how he was changing, but I think some of the things I said, he was reading extensively, and he, in addition to to write, he read a lot. I think that he was changing some of his opinions. I don't know that, but that's just the feeling I have.
Oh, sure. He was very affected by Vatican II and fully embraced it.
Okay.
No, he was a leading light, really, in our diocese.
And remind you that he was born in 1902, so by this time in the 70s, he will die in 81 or 80. And what I don't mention is he continues to write, and mainly it's not editorials, but he will respond to letters like in the Sunday Visitor or different publications. He continues to do that, so you know that he was reading and being active. So I still say someone needs to write a book about it. So, any other questions or comments?
Did you come across the Catholic Digest in any of this?
I think that he would have considered that popular literature, not scholarly.
Okay.
I
By
mean,
the
the Catholic.
time I was at St. Thomas in the 90s, they were trying to decide what to do with it because people weren't buying or subscribing anymore. And I don't know what ultimately happened to it, but
I don't know if it's still published, but in the letters, it's a word, readability. And they were saying, we must have this level of readability, and he made the comment that the readability goes down. the vocabulary is not there with the students, and so the people have to write in a simpler way. And if you look at his education, you know, CU backwards, he had an education that we would admire today. So, okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.